The blueprint to life on our planet is a remarkable molecule called DNA. But what if all the DNA in your body just vanished? Would you die instantly? Would it take a while for the effects to kick in? Would you even notice anything happening at all? My guess is it will play out a little differently than you might think. Let's explore this idea. In all of our years looking up to the cosmos, we yet to find any other signs of life, even if it is statistically likely that it exists. Now, we care so much about finding life because life is an extraordinary thing, especially complex living organisms like me or you. And what makes this life possible? DNA. Now, I'm sure you've heard of DNA before, but what actually is it? And what does it do in our bodies? What's its purpose? So let's look at that now. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, and it's one of the fundamental biological molecules along with proteins, lipids and carbohydrates. DNA is made up of a ribose sugar, which is a 5-carbon sugar that has an oxygen knocked off it, deoxyribo. And then it has a phosphate group added to it, and it has a nitrogenous base, making a deoxyribonucleic acid. Now, that whole structure is called a nucleotide. And this nucleotide is a piece of a long chain. Now we know that DNA doesn't just look like a long line of nucleic acids. No, it's in this wonderful shape called a double helix. So we have 2 strands that are going in opposite directions that are then twisted together, held together nicely by intermolecular forces, many of them being hydrogen bonds. Now, what's brilliant about this structure is that it can be unwound and unzipped so that the nucleotide order can be read. And this is where the function of DNA comes in. DNA only codes for proteins. That's all it does. So, each of these bases, the nitrogenous bases I was talking about, are either adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And these can be read, kind of like the letters or words in a book. And the order of these bases will tell the body what they code for. So, 3 bases in a row is called a codon, and this codon codes for an amino acid. When you have a bunch of these amino acids come together, that will be made outside of the nucleus being where the DNA is stored. Those things will go to a ribosome, and that will code for a protein to be made when the amino acids are strung together and formed into some kind of shape. This protein will then go and do things in the body. Maybe it will be an enzyme, maybe it will form part of a structure inside or on the surface of the cell. Maybe it will be a hormone that will be secreted later. Sometimes that protein is added together with either a carbohydrate or a lipid or a fat, and that will be either a hormone or some kind of chemical that will go out and do something else in the body. So, your DNA is literally just a roadmap that says these are the proteins that we wish to code for. A bunch of these codons together, a bunch of these bases together, a section of DNA is called a gene. And this makes up your genome. So all the genes that you have, they will make your genome. Those are the things that will code for either a protein or a group of proteins that carry out a similar or single function. So now we understand what DNA does and why it is so vital for our cells in all living organisms. So let's get rid of it. I don't feel any different. Do I look any different? Well, actually, not much has changed. But there is something that has changed. All the DNA's gone. So I'm a little bit lighter. Not significantly though that I will feel a lot better going on my summer holidays. I'm only about 150 grams or 1/3 of a pound lighter, which is not that great. If I really wanted to lose that weight, I could just go to the toilet and come back. So besides that, we would now have to wait a while because our cells can now no longer unzip, code for proteins, divide, grow, anything like that. So we've got to wait for a while for those effects to kick in. But we don't really know this because this has not really happened. DNA doesn't just kind of disappear from humans. So we've got to look at certain examples as So what could happen when DNA stops doing its job? And there's a few things we can look at. The first thing being something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, chemotherapy. So chemotherapy is used to treat cancer patients. Now what cancer is, essentially in a nutshell, is cells that divide in an uncontrolled manner. Our cells divide all the time, but it's in a very controlled, measured way. However, when this is unregulated, it can cause problems with clumps of cells, maybe breaking off and clogging vital organs, or going and putting pressure on certain systems, that meaning that they function less efficiently. Now, chemotherapy is a bit of a blunt tool in that it tends to target rapidly dividing cells, no matter where they are in the body. One typical cancer drug does this in a way that it binds to DNA and kind of clumps it together to make little balls of it, so it can't be nicely stretched out, unzipped and read so that it can coat with proteins. Now, because cancer cells are rapidly growing, that's useful. The problem is, like I've said before, it targets all rapidly dividing cells. And one group of rapidly dividing cells are the ones that are in your bone marrow. So your bone marrow is where blood cell production happens. So all of the stem cells that allows us to recur will be doing a lot of dividing and will be doing a lot of proliferation. This means that by targeting those cells, by clumping their DNA together so proteins can't be synthesized anymore, they're not going to be producing any blood cells. Not just red blood cells, but white blood cells as well. Now your white blood cells, or lymphocytes, are part of your immune system. So it is common for cancer patients who are undergoing chemotherapy to have a much weakened immune system. Now this means that they are more prone to infection and need to be monitored in a separate way and can be given drugs to help with this situation. It's also why hair loss is very common. Now there's another example that we can use that you probably didn't see coming but could easily happen to you. And we'll discuss that later. But first, something that you've definitely heard of. Radiation poisoning. Now whether you are unfortunate enough to be close enough to a nuclear power plant when there's a meltdown, or if you happened to be somewhere where an atomic bomb has been detonated, you will have undergone some form of radiation poisoning. Now in these instances, this is where a whole lot of gamma radiation has been bombarding your cells, ionizing the molecules that make up DNA, getting rid of electrons, changing the structure and the function of the DNA so that it's no longer working. In these instances, the effects happen usually over days, weeks, months, sometimes even years. But we're thinking about this on a much bigger, much more intense scale. And it's not very common that someone gets rid of all of their DNA. However, there is one instance that we can look at someone who's undergone the highest dose of radiation exposure in a single instant ever recorded in history. It's 1999 in Japan. The country is trying to find ways to fuel its industrialization, and with it importing almost all of its fuel sources, they think of a way that they can produce the fuel themselves. So they decide nuclear power is the way to do that. So the first power plant is erected in 1999. With growing pressure to supply as much power as possible, the company that owns the power plant decided to cut corners in certain things. One of the divisions of the power plant is to recycle and reuse old radioactive materials along with other substances to make uranium fuel rods. And the process by which this happens is a lengthy process that includes 3 very careful stages. These stages require a lot of equipment and machinery that are costly and time intensive. And one of the ways the company decides to cut back on this is there is this process by which you have a uranium powder and it's in a mixture and it is usually mixed by a machine. This is expensive and can take a long time. So the company tells the engineers and the technicians that they can mix them by hand. Now one morning, A particular engineer called Hisashi Ochi and 2 of his colleagues start their morning as usual. But they understand there's a lot of demand for these fuel rods and everyone is under a lot of pressure. So they decide that they're able to put in 7 times the concentration of uranium powder that is allowed by the company, by the plant. Now, Hisashi is pouring over this steel container, like this. There is someone on a ladder pouring in the uranium powder, and there is the colleague that is standing 4 meters away. Once this uranium powder is poured into this mixture, a flash of blue light appears, and their fates are sealed. By having so much radioactive material in this mixture, they have unknowingly created an uncontrolled chain fission reaction. The blue light created was Cherenkov radiation, whereby gamma radiation is blasted out, ionizing the air around it, and electrons are moving at or even above the speed of light, giving off a blue glow. Hisashi, being the closest to the reaction, is in excruciating pain. He's vomiting, he's short of breath, and within a few minutes he's passed out. He and his colleagues are rushed to a hospital in Tokyo, where by the time he gets there, he's feeling absolutely fine. And the staff at the hospital are hopeful that he's going to be able to pull through. The staff at the hospital are told that radiation poisoning is likely to have happened. So they take a sample from his bone marrow to assess the damage done to his cells. When they assess it, they understand that this is not a typical case. The chromosomes that are in those cells, so that is very supercoiled structures of DNA, are obliterated. They're in bits, some parts are clumped together in very unnatural ways, and they understand that none of the DNA in his body is of any use. It's almost like he has no DNA, the situation that we're talking about right now. Now, as we talked about with chemotherapy patients, the staff know that he's going to be immunocompromised. So they take him into a quarantined room to try to mitigate the rate of infection. On top of this, the researchers see this as an opportunity to potentially perform an experimental procedure, a hematopoietic stem cell transplant, something that has never been done before. Thankfully, Hisashi's sister was a match and agrees to be a donor for the procedure. They do the stem cell transplant, and as the days goes on, his white blood cell count increases. They're hopeful. They think that he may indeed pull through. Problem is, after a few days, they realize the radiation in his body has now attacked the healthy cells that have been transplanted. So the white blood cell count goes back down, and they're back to square one. On top of this, his skin begins to peel off, and his lungs fill up with fluid, so he can't even breathe without being assisted. The lining of his intestines begin to peel off, so that any food that he does consume, the nutrients aren't being able to be absorbed into the body, along with any fluids that he consumes. This leads to leaking fluid and uncontrolled bleeding from his gastrointestinal system. So at one point he's needing 10, maybe 12 blood transfusions per day. And with his skin peeling off, his body can't hold on to the fluids that is being fed through IV. So it's leaking out of his pores, to the point that they're having to measure the amount of fluid he's losing and trying to reintroduce that back into his system at a constant rate. They even try giving him large skin grafts to try to control the amount of fluid he's losing from his skin, but because of what's happened to his body already, the skin grafts just do not take. With the elasticity in his skin gone, his eyelids would keep cracking every time he blinked, so it looked like he was crying blood. Eventually, his heart would give out after being under the stress of the whole situation, beating twice the speed a normal human being would be at rest. And after being resuscitated a few times, Hisashi finally dies 83 days after the incident. Whew, that was a heavy one. But we can see what may happen if you or I were to lose all of our DNA. If you have any other suggestions as to weird things that we can think about and theorize together, leave them in the comments and we'll see if we can make a video about them. But most of us don't work in nuclear power stations, thankfully, so we shouldn't really have any of those things to think about. However, I'm sure almost all of us have walked through a forest at some point in our lives and seen mushrooms growing up on the forest floor, potentially one with a white cap. You may have heard of the death cap mushroom, or maybe the destroying angel, which is a really sick name by the way. Particularly, you've been told you should not eat one if you find one. But why? Why am I bringing up mushrooms in this talk about what may happen if your DNA suddenly disappears? Well, it's about what they have in them. Amatoxins. Now, these deadly chemicals work by inhibiting an enzyme called RNA polymerase, which is important in the synthesis of proteins. Now, remember what we talked about in terms of the function of DNA, which is to code for proteins? Well, RNA polymerase is part of the process that takes us from the stuff that's in your DNA to bringing it outside of the nucleus to those ribosomes and making a protein from the amino acids. Therefore, if we inhibit RNA polymerase, it's like the DNA isn't doing its job and it wasn't even there in the first place. So if you were to ingest one of these mushrooms, what would happen? Well, with the amatoxins now in your bloodstream, they start to really concentrate within the liver, and this is where it's done its damage. Initially, you're not going to feel very well after a few hours. You're going to start having those abdominal pains. You're going to feel sick, maybe have diarrhea, maybe shortness of breath, just like with radiation or chemotherapy. But then, after not too long, you'll start to feel fine. Now, this is a common theme that has come up in all of these examples, and this is something called the white ghost phase, usually in the 4 stages of radiation poisoning. The second stage is where, after you've had some gastrointestinal issues, nothing happens. And that's because it takes time for the effects of not being able to code for any proteins to take effect. Now at this point, irreversible damage is being done. After 2 to 3 days, your hepatocytes or liver cells are no longer functioning. They don't divide, they don't grow, they don't code for any proteins, and they'll more likely die of necrosis. With so many necrotic cells in the liver failure bound to happen. Not only that, but the amatoxins do tend to build up in the kidneys, so kidney failure is another thing that may happen. Thankfully, if medical intervention occurs within enough time, a liver transplant may be enough to save you. Along with kidney dialysis, as renal failure is also about to happen. So if you were to lose all of your DNA, I reckon it would happen a lot like that. First, you'd probably have a bit of a tummy upset, not feel good, feel faint. If it's really bad, you'll probably pass out. But this is all happening to you at once, so this is going to be very intense. After a tiny little phase of feeling okay, everything's going to shut down. Your intestines are not going to be working. Your liver is going to start failing. Your kidneys are going to fail. Your cardiovascular system is not going to start being able to pump blood around the body like it used to. And I reckon within about a day or 2, that's you gone. However, I wonder what it would be like to make a planet out of hamsters.